Well, welcome once again to another live stream from this YouTube channel, Life Lessons from the Bible. And of course, there's another session on prayer. And these sessions are really designed to be very informal, not very well, structured and planned, but just to get in some very, I guess, conversational and informal study in the Word of God. And for the last few sessions, actually from the session last week and I guess the one before, we started looking at prayer, and we'll be continuing that today in this live stream. And again, as I said, this is really intended to be very, very informal, and not really too much preparation, but we'll see how it goes as it relates to this. So prayer is what we are doing and what we have been looking at, and we will continue to look at that today. Really and truly, what we have been doing is looking at prayer, but not really looking at prayer in terms of just simply talking about what prayer means, and giving all kinds of definitions on prayer. But we have been looking at prayer in terms of how how prayer developed over the course of the Bible, beginning from all the way in Genesis chapter 1 with Adam and Eve, and all the way to the end. And we really only looked at things related to the beginning, um, in terms of let me just correct this here. I guess we're good here. So we only looked at Genesis chapter 1. Actually, we only looked at the part where Adam and Eve and everything before the fall, where everything was good in terms of the interaction between Adam and Eve and God. And we looked at the fact that in the last live stream, we looked at the fact that that relationship was very direct, it was very intentional, it was very intimate. In terms of prayer, the one of the amazing things about prayer when God created Adam and Eve is that the Bible doesn't record God giving Adam and Eve, any um, instructions on how to pray. It doesn't record giving Adam and Eve any kind of guidelines or template on how to pray. It seems as though they just knew how to pray. They knew how to speak to God. They knew how to talk to God and so on. Um, and so they did. The Bible simply records God coming out in the cool of the day, and he was there interacting with them. Sadly, they sinned eventually. But before the sin took place, the Bible simply records that they had a conversation, or it seems to be implying that they had regular times, daily times with God. But for the purpose of this live stream, what we want to extract from that is the fact that there was no direct um, guideline given by God to Adam and Eve. There was no instruction saying, well, when you, at least there's nothing recorded in the Bible where God said, when you come to me, this is how you need to talk to me. And when I come to you, this is how I will talk to you. And this is how we will spend time together. It seems without that kind of written guideline in the Bible, it seems as though Adam and Eve naturally knew how to come to God. They were created and they were built, it seems, with the natural, the in the inner knowledge and or we could use the word intuitive sense in knowing how to come to God and how to relate to God. It seems as though God created man with that natural ability and natural inbuilt understanding on how to pray, how to relate to Him, and there was no need for divine instruction in a written code or even an oral, um, relaying things orally. It seems that men just simply knew, Adam and Eve simply knew how to come to God. And that's very, very instructional. That's very, very, um, important because what Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, even into chapter 3, what it seems to imply is that prayer originally was not something God intended to become, you know, something done based on a formula or based on some form of instructions. Prayer really, originally, it seems as though God intended prayer to be um, a natural inbuilt knowledge about knowing how to come to God and coming to God freely. Um, from that natural, that place of naturally knowing Him. And so this seems to be what Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, and even when you go into chapter 3, what the Bible was showing us. And the reason why that's interesting is because when you come to the New Testament, when God in the book of Hebrews, when the author in Hebrews was talking about the new covenant, one of the things that he quoted from the Old Testament in the book of Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah gave a prophecy of how things will be like in the new covenant. And that prophecy that Jeremiah gave, one of the things he said was nobody will need to be taught about knowing God and about, you know, coming to God. But everybody in that prophecy says God says he will put his law on the inside of man. And everybody will instinctively know the Lord. They will instinctively come to God. And that is it seems to be that is exactly what was going on in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and as I said, even into chapter 3, where there was an instinctive knowledge about how to come to God, and there was no need for somebody to teach, not even God himself, to teach Adam and Eve how to do that. It seems that they knew how to do it. They were built, they were designed for this. And so the natural state of man, the natural design, the natural way man was built, it seems, was with the inner knowledge, the instinctive knowledge about the fact that we need to talk to God, we need to interact with God. But also, it seems that they had that instinct, that inner knowledge, knowing how to do it, how to come to God, how to interact with God, and how to talk to God. And so that's what they did in that time before the fall. But in looking at prayer throughout the Bible, there are so many different periods. The first period, as we just said, is the one before the fall. And then the next time frame is after the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned, which took place in Genesis chapter 3, when the serpent came and tempted Eve. And then from that time when Adam and Eve sinned until the time just before Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt and they instituted the Old Covenant, the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, that time frame between the fall in Genesis 3 and in Exodus, when the law or the Old Testament system was formally introduced by Moses, in that time frame there, what we have, people generally call it the patriarchal time. And there's another time frame when we need to look at prayer. Of course, after that time frame will be when Moses instituted the Old Testament system. We had in Exodus and Leviticus, more so in Leviticus. And then even after that time would be when they came into the promised land and the king's reign and so on. And of course, we go even more into when they were exiled into Babylon and into Assyria. And another time period would be when they came back, when the Babylonian captives came back and they started to rebuild the temple. And yet another time period would be when, after all of that, that period of time, then before Jesus came, that's when John the Baptist was there, and there were a number of things going on. And of course, after that would be a period of time when Jesus came, and when he was on the earth, how he prayed and how he instructed the disciples to pray. Another period after that, of course, would be with the apostles and the early church and how they did things. That'll be from the book of Acts all the way to Revelation. And so there's so many different periods you would have to look at in terms of the development of prayer throughout the scriptures and see how um, prayer was done, what prayer meant to these people in the different time frames. And so when we look at it from that perspective, we could begin to learn and gather an understanding of what prayer really is, how prayer is supposed to be done. As a matter of fact, before we even begin to talk about how prayer is supposed to be done, this will help us to get a mind frame, a proper mindset, and thinking about prayer and what attitude we need to have towards prayer. And then with that mind frame, then we begin to talk about how prayer itself should be done. And so we looked at the time with Adam and Eve before the fall, and now today in this live stream, we're going to look at after the fall. In the period of time we generally call the patriarchal time. And patriarchal comes from patriarch, which simply means the fathers. You know, the Old Testament fathers from which the tribe, the nation of Israel came. And that, of course, would be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the main three characters in the Old Testament. Actually, before the Old Covenant, they were the ones mainly that God came, spoke to, called, and identified that He would be their God, and that from them, um, he would call his people Israel. And so this is what we are looking at today. This is where we are. And so when we begin to look at this, one of the interesting things that we begin to see is in the Old Testament time, the especially in this patriarchal time that we are in, the prayer or the concept of prayer, just as with Adam and Eve, where there was no direct teaching about prayer that's recorded in the scriptures, there's no um, structure that God gave them in prayer. That's the same scenario we see in the patriarchal time. There was no recorded teaching on telling people how they need to pray and how they need to come to God. This is very interesting because even in the patriarchal times, men came to God and they prayed and they talked to God. And this is after the fall. Even after sin took place in Genesis chapter 3, and even though men fell, and then we went into Genesis chapter 6 with all of the crazy things about the sons of God coming into the daughters of men, which is a very interesting thing, and all of the corruption that took place there, even with the world going to such um, downgrade where God had to judge the world and wipe out the world with the flood with Noah. Even in that context and afterwards, there was no, at least recorded in the Bible, no teaching on how to pray. All the way from Genesis chapter 3 to Leviticus, Exodus and Leviticus, people simply came and approached God and talked and prayed and called upon him and especially in Abraham's case, had some very personal and close and intimate conversations with God. But they did all of that without any recorded directions from God, specific instructions from God on how to do things. So what we had basically is people um, coming to God. Like for example, Abraham. What God did in after the fall is that He came and He began having um, making covenants with people, and based on the covenants that He made with people, that He initiated and instituted with individuals, and then by extension with Israel as a whole, it was based on those covenants that He initiated. That is how particular individuals began to pray and talk to God in a very personal and intimate way. So, for example, in the before the fall, after the fall, that took place in Genesis chapter 3. But by the time we reach chapter 6, we see people corrupted. Actually, the whole world was corrupted. And so God had to call one man. The Bible says Noah found grace and he was perfect in his generation. And God had to call him. And, you know, eventually God saved Noah and his family. But God came to Noah and God had to, he initiated that interaction with Noah. And that's one of the interesting things about the patriarchal period. And not only that, but the rest of the Bible is God always is the one who initiated covenants. He was always the one who initiated coming to people. And because he came to particular individuals in response to his initiation, in response to him taking the initiative, men responded to him. And prayer seems to be one of the things that took place after the fall. It is in response to God's initiative in coming to people in specific cases like Noah and Abraham, and then later on um, Jacob and Isaac and so on. God took the initiative, came to people, it made covenant with people. When Noah came out of the flood, God gave Noah the rainbow as a sign, a covenant between him and mankind. So that was covenant again there. And it was based on that covenant that he made with man, with particular man. It says that that is how men were able to respond to God in specific personal ways. And that's one of the things that the Bible shows us in terms of prayer in this period of time we call the patriarchal time, where the fathers operated. And so beginning with Noah, God came and God spoke to Noah. The Bible simply says that Noah was perfect in generation. And then God began to speak to him, to build an ark and so on to the saving of his family. But God came and spoke to him. And then, in response to God coming to him, Noah responded by doing what God says, but also in talking to God. That's one of the interesting things. But then, when you come to Genesis chapter 15, with respect to Abram, God changes his name from Abram into Abraham. The interesting thing there is that God came to Abraham. Actually, we back up to Genesis chapter 12. God called Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees, and then God, when Abraham responded and came out, the Bible says God said to Abraham, he said three things to Abraham, Genesis chapter 12 from verse 1 to 3. He says, um, from you I will make a great people, they will possess a land, and through that people all families of the earth will be blessed. And then he made a covenant again. This word covenant keeps coming up. He made a covenant with Abraham later on in Genesis chapter 15. And then with this covenant that God made with Abraham, one of the interesting things is that Abraham began to respond to God. And Abraham, when we read the Bible, had such a very intimate relationship with God, where he began to respond to God very personally and very directly. Abraham, there was a time when God appeared to Abraham to speak to him about Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 18. And when God told Abraham that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, the interesting thing we see is the kind of conversation Abraham was able to have with God and to intercede for Sodom and Gomorrah and to get God to actually practically negotiate with God, which is very interesting. When you think about it, for a man to have a negotiation, a round of negotiation or rounds of negotiation with God, and to get God to change his mind on how he's going to do things. That's powerful. That is that. I mean, that's powerful. That's a very privileged position, and that is the position Abraham had when it comes to prayer in the old, even before the old covenant was instituted. This was before even Moses was born. But that shows us one of the things about prayer is that even though prayer, there's no record of Abraham being taught how to pray, and there's no record of Abraham having any structure or order given to him about prayer. What it shows us is because God instituted or initiated covenant with Abraham, it was the covenant and that kind of covenant relationship God had with Abraham, which gave Abraham the boldness, the confidence to come to God and to make these kinds of bold requests that we see in Genesis chapter 18. And so this is interesting. The 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 the, the, the covenant in the patriarchal times seems to be the basis on which they interacted with God, and especially the basis on which prayer was done. Even though there's no record of God telling people in the covenant how to pray, the fact that He made covenant with them and the terms of that covenant, and then the way that how He related to them in that covenant seems to give men some sense of understanding about God. And therefore, it gave them a sense of boldness and a sense of, you know, direct knowledge or direct relationship with God so they could come to Him and they could speak with Him. And so, this is what we see with Abraham. In these times, there seems to be a directness in prayer when men came to God directly and a familiarity as well. Knowing this God and having familiar um, relationship with Him. That's very interesting. Even though there was no teaching about it, it seems to be something that was naturally known on the inside. But now, one of the things that seems to happen is because of the covenant, there's now this boldness, the different covenants that He made. So He made a covenant with Abraham, first with Noah, and then He made a covenant with Abraham. But then eventually God called Jacob and he spoke to Jacob, he appeared to Jacob and so on, and went into covenant with Jacob. And when we read Genesis chapter, this would be Genesis chapter 32, the Bible talk about Jacob wrestling with God and having a conversation with God and telling God that, asking God to bless him and so on. That in its whole self is a very strange thing. The angel of the Lord appeared and then Jacob having a conversation with the Abraham and with the angel and telling the angel, having a wrestle to be wrestling with the angel of God. There are some accounts in the Old Testament that's really, really strange, to us. But when you talk about the angel of God, which is God Himself appearing in the Old Testament, which probably was Jesus, and a mere man is wrestling with him. These seems to be some very strange and very, weird accounts. But in that, Jacob spoke to the angel and said, I am not going to let you go until you bless me. And again, that was prayer taking place there, and that was some serious, you know, intense prayer because there was war. There was wrestling. The Bible actually talk about it. He wrestled with the angel, and then the angel touched his side, of course, and then he blessed him. Your name will be Israel. But that's one of the interesting things with prayer, the covenant that God made with Jacob. Because remember, God appeared. Jacob saw this ladder going, and the angels going up and down, and God um, called them and so on. The covenant that God made with um, Jacob in that case, it resulted later in Jacob having even more conversation with God, and Jacob being changed from who he was, a con man, into a man who was now called by God and acting as the one of the patriarchs for the people of Israel, the nation of Israel as a whole. And of course, it continues even there. The Bible continues to go on from Jacob. You go all the way down to um, Isaac and so on. Uh, the Bible talks about how they function as well. And even with them, the whole concept of covenant continues. But the main point is in this time between the fall and Moses, this time period we call the patriarchal time. One of the interesting things here is that, again, there seems to be no formal teaching in prayer. Prayer seems to be something that people knew instinctively how to do. But it came out, prayer was done more so because of covenants. And the covenants was initiated by God Himself. There were people praying generally, but there were specific individuals that God appeared to. And it seems as though, on the basis of the covenants that He initiated with these people were able to experience prayer and to go about prayer in a very unique and powerful way. Again, Noah, Abraham. Abraham is one of the most powerful examples there. And then, of course, Jacob and Isaac going on. We didn't talk about Isaac, but um, you know, he's one of those that God made the covenant with as well. So the whole point is that prayer is something, when you look at the development of it in the scriptures, beginning with Adam and Eve, it seems that was just natural. God created them in a perfect environment, so they naturally knew there was a natural inbred instinct on how to approach God and how to talk to God. um, a natural knowledge of God. No need for teaching and law and instructions and prayer. There was a natural thing. And then even after the fall, during the patriarchal times, even after that, with all of the sin and the depth of sin that men went into, but we see in Genesis 6 where God had to wipe off the earth. It seems as though men still had a sense of knowledge about God and how to approach Him. But what God did in that time now was to get into covenant relationship in calling people and speaking to people. And it seems as though in that particular context of covenant, the people He called and made covenant with had an even greater understanding of prayer and an even more powerful experience in prayer. And so one of the big revelation in the Bible is that the covenants is what gave that boldness and helped men to experience and get a revelation in prayer. So you move from the perfection of Adam and Eve, that perfect environment, into the time of sin with the patriarch and covenants, and how covenants help men to get into prayer. And that's a big lesson because we have a covenant with God today. It's called the new covenant. And in this covenant, and one of the great things is that we have the Bible to give us the understanding of what this covenant is about and how it functions. And if they were able to get into prayer because they had covenants with God, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on, then we have a covenant as well. It's not the same covenant, but we have a covenant. So we could learn from the covenant and get into prayer. Um, but this is where we are in terms of the patriarchal time. When we come to the next live stream, we'll look at after the patriarchal time, which is when Moses came in. and how things function with prayer then, which is where things started to get codified, put into structure and order. And so we'll see that. So we could learn about prayer and understand how prayer is done, um, and what are the lessons for us in terms of prayer. And so we'll stop here for this live stream. Let me close off this. And so thank you very much for joining with me. Thank you very much for looking at this. And hopefully this has been helpful, and hopefully this has been interesting. Until we come to the next time, take care, stay strong, and God bless you.